What would it actually take to kill a god in Warhammer 40,000? Not defeat it for a battle, not banish one of its demons, not wound its servants in real space. I mean truly end it, erase it, reduce it to absence. And if any chaos god feels both vulnerable and impossible at the same time, it is Slaanesh, the youngest of the great powers, the god born from excess, obsession, sensation, and ruin. Slaanesh has a beginning. That is already unusual. So tonight, the question is simple, and very dangerous. If Slaanesh was born, could Slaanesh also die? To answer that, we need to move slowly through some of the darkest and strangest corners of Warhammer lore. We need to talk about the ancient Aeldari at the very height of their power. We need to talk about what the warp really is, or at least what mortal minds can survive understanding. We need to talk about the nature of gods, and whether a being made of emotion can ever be destroyed so long as emotion itself remains. And then, even if destruction is possible in theory, we need to ask the more unsettling question: what would happen to the galaxy if it actually occurred? At first, Slaanesh seems easier to imagine destroying than the other major chaos gods. Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch feel almost timeless. They represent rage, decay, ambition, change, war, hope, despair, scheming, plague, and the endless contradictions of mortal life. Their roots seem to reach into every age. But Slaanesh has a very specific origin story. The Prince of Pleasure did not simply lurk in full power from the dawn of history. Slaanesh coalesced through the catastrophic model collapse of the ancient Aeldari Empire until the pressure of untold psychic depravity burst into divine consciousness. There was a before. There was a moment of birth. There was a scream. That fact tempts us toward a comforting idea. If a god can be created by conditions, perhaps a god can be unmade by changing those conditions. If a being is born from obsession and excess, maybe starve it. If it feeds on sensation, deny sensation. If it drinks souls, close the cup. But Warhammer 40,000 is almost never that merciful. The setting is built on feedback loops, not easy endings. Once something terrible becomes real in the warp, it does not simply vanish because mortals regret what they have done. To understand why, we have to begin with the Aeldari before the fall, because no discussion of Slaanesh makes sense without the scale of the civilization that created it. The ancient Aeldari were not merely one more starfaring species among many. They were among the greatest powers the galaxy had ever seen. They inherited a place in the long aftermath of the war in heaven. They possessed psychic mastery beyond what most species could imagine. Their technology was not crude machinery alone, but a seamless union of mind, art, material science, and psychic craft. They built empire not as struggling colonists, but as beings of almost casual superiority. The old Aeldari did not merely survive. They flourished so completely that need itself became rare. Enemies dwindled, labor diminished, mastery over matter and sensation increased. Desire could be indulged with almost no restraint. This is a dangerous condition for any people. In Warhammer, comfort does not lead automatically to wisdom. It often leads to spiritual rot. The Aeldari had power without challenge, appetite without scarcity, and extraordinary psychic sensitivity, but made every thought and impulse resonate more strongly than those of lesser races. Their empire became a civilization with no breaks. At first, decline was not obvious. A culture can decay while still appearing magnificent. The cities still gleamed, the arts still bloomed, knowledge still expanded, but a subtle shift had begun. Refinement turned toward indulgence. Indulgence escalated into transgression. Transgression became sport. Sensation had to become stronger and stranger to pierce the numbness of previous excess. Pursuit of pleasure widened until it included cruelty. The pursuit of novelty invited sacrilege. Entire social worlds formed around appetite. The old disciplines withered, moral boundaries dissolved. What had once been a great people became a psychic engine of self-corruption. This matters because the Aeldari were not like humanity. Human vice stains the warp, certainly, but the Aeldari were vastly more psychically potent. Their thoughts had weight, their passions had force. Their collective decadence did not just shape culture, it reshaped the immaterial realm itself. As generation after generation sank deeper into obsession, the warp began to curdle around them. Great emotional currents gathered. The unborn Slaanesh was not yet awake, but it was gestating in nightmare. This process was not entirely invisible. Some among the Aeldari recognized that something had gone terribly wrong. The ancestors of the craft-world Aeldari distanced themselves from the decaying heart of the Empire. The Exodites fled even further, rejecting luxury and embracing hardship on distant maiden worlds. These groups are important because they prove the fall was not inevitable in the mechanical sense. Warnings existed. Alternatives existed. Escape, for some, was possible. But the core civilization did not turn back. It continued downward, perhaps unable, perhaps unwilling, to comprehend that its pleasures were becoming a god. And then came the fall. In the material universe, it was a civilizational apocalypse. In the warp, it was a birth cry of almost unimaginable violence. Slaanesh awakened in an instant of catastrophic psychic consumption. The heart of the Aeldari Empire was annihilated. Countless souls were devoured. The Eye of Terror tore open as a vast wound between real space and the warp. Entire worlds died. Whole populations vanished. The old Aeldari Dominion, one of the greatest galactic powers ever known, was effectively shattered in a single metaphysical disaster. This is often described as Slaanesh being born from the sins of the Aeldari, which is true, but not complete. Slaanesh was not born and then calmly fed. Slaanesh was born ravenous. The first act of the newborn god was a feast on the species that created it. Since then, the relationship between Slaanesh and the Aeldari has been one of predation, trauma, and existential terror. Most Aeldari do not merely dislike Slaanesh. They organize their entire surviving civilizations around avoiding eternal consumption by Slaanesh. Spirit stones, infinity circuits, soul discipline, the path system, Comarag's horrors, Yinaid's promise, all of these are in some way responses to that original doom. Now we can begin the deeper part of the question. If Slaanesh had a birth, what exactly was born? Was it just a giant warp predator? Was it a sentient storm? Was it an embodiment of concepts? In Warhammer lore, chaos gods are all of these things at once, and that makes the matter of destruction far more difficult than simply killing a powerful being. The warp is not another galaxy with planets and armies in the conventional sense. It is a parallel realm of psychic energy, emotion, symbolism, contradiction, and impossible geography. It reflects sentient thought, but not in a neat mirror. It exaggerates, it distorts, it loops. Time in the warp is not orderly. Cause and effect do not behave in the way mortal minds expect. A being formed in the warp is therefore not limited in the same way as a biological organism or even a machine. A Chaos God is not held together by flesh that can be punctured, or a brain that can be destroyed, or a single location that can be bombarded from orbit. More than that, a Chaos God is partly identical with the emotional and psychic patterns that sustain it. Khorne is not just a warlord in a hell dimension. Khorne is inseparable from rage, violence, bloodshed, martial pride, and slaughter as psychic realities. Nurgle is not simply a plague king sitting somewhere in the warp. Nurgle is deeply bound to decay, despair, endurance, disease, and the grotesque comfort found in surrender. Tzeentch is not merely a sorcerer god issuing plans. Tzeentch is ambition, change, deceit, hope, manipulation, transformation. Slaanesh is not just a prince on a throne. Slaanesh is excess, obsession, perfectionism, indulgence, addiction, sensation, vanity, hunger for experience, and the consuming pursuit of more. That means Slaanesh is not sustained only by the ancient Aeldari crime that caused the fall. That event created the god, or perhaps brought to coherence what had been building in the warp. But after birth, Slaanesh became a galaxy-wide power, feeding on many species, many cultures, and many forms of appetite. Humans empower Slaanesh. Drukhari cultures of torment and excess empower Slaanesh even as they try to survive its thirst. Every act of obsession, every all-consuming fixation, every ecstatic cruelty, every hunger for sensation pushed beyond all limit sends some reflection into the warp. The god does not depend on one single nation still existing in the same decadent form that created it. This is the first major reason Slaanesh seems almost impossible to destroy. The source has diversified. The conditions of birth are gone, but the ecology of feeding remains. If the old Aeldari Empire had survived, and then somehow reformed itself before the birth cry, perhaps Slaanesh would never have emerged. But once emerged, Slaanesh joined the stable catastrophe of chaos. It became one of the great powers that feed, not on a single ritual or species alone, but on recurring truths of sentient life. Still, we should be careful here. Almost impossible is not the same as impossible. Warhammer lore leaves just enough ambiguity to keep the question alive. There are hints, theories, prophecies, and edge cases that suggest even a chaos god is not absolutely beyond harm. It is just that harm at this scale means something very different from what we usually mean by death. Consider first the simplest possibility. Could military force destroy Slaanesh? If the Imperium launched a crusade into the warp, if the Necrons unleashed superweapons, if the Emperor rose in full divine splendor, if every daemon of Slaanesh were banished, the answer is almost certainly no. Daemons are not the god itself. Greater daemons, keepers of secrets, and all lesser manifestations are expressions, shards, servants, and protrusions of Slaanesh's will and nature. But they are not the entirety of the being. Even if one could annihilate endless hosts of them, the source remains. Likewise, invading the warp is not like invading a capital world. There is no clean center of gravity that, once taken, causes the empire to collapse. Even the so-called realms of chaos should not be understood too literally. The palace of Slaanesh exists in lore and vision, yes, but it is not simply a palace made of bricks at an address you can mark on a star chart. It is a mythic truth, a symbolic domain, a place that is also a state, a narrative, an emanation of divine nature. One can enter such places in stories, visions, warp journeys, and metaphysical confrontations. But storming the palace and killing the god is the kind of idea that belongs to heroic fantasy more than to the toxic metaphysics of 40K. What about opposing gods? Could the other chaos gods destroy Slaanesh? They certainly oppose, undermine, and war against one another in the great game. Khorne hates sorcery and decadence. Nurgle and Tzeentch embody clashing principles. Slaanesh contests all of them for worship, emotion, and souls. Yet the great game seems less like a path to final victory and more like a perpetual balance of monstrosities. The chaos gods can wound each other's influence, steal ground, devastate legions, and consume lesser powers. But the setting repeatedly suggests that they are locked in endless rivalry precisely because none can achieve stable absolute supremacy without destabilizing the very field in which they exist. If, for example, Khorne somehow extinguished every trace of Slaaneshan impulse in the galaxy, Khorne would also be changing the psychic environment on which Khorne depends. Sentient life is not neatly partitioned. Rage overlaps with obsession, ambition overlaps with excess, despair overlaps with indulgence. The gods are distinct, but mortal emotion is entangled. Total victory for one principle may be incoherent in a universe where minds generate many passions at once. Then there is the Emperor, perhaps the most tempting candidate for a god-killer. In some interpretations, the Emperor is becoming, or has become, something vast in the warp himself. His light burns demons. His presence opposes chaos. Saints, miracles, and the Astronomicon all imply that his psychic might is colossal. If any single entity in the setting might confront a chaos god, surely it would be him. And yet even here, the lore remains uncertain. The Emperor can wound chaos, repel it, and in some contexts, perhaps threaten it in ways no mortal empire can. But destruction in the absolute sense is another matter. If the Emperor is becoming more godlike through worship, he may also be proving the very rule that powerful psychic patterns do not simply erase one another like chess pieces, they become rival absolutes. Another possibility comes from anti-warp forces. The Necrons, with their history of fighting the Old Ones and Catan, wield technologies that can suppress, wound, and distort the warp's influence in real space. Blackstone structures, pylons, null fields, and related phenomena suggest that the material universe can be insulated, at least partially, from immaterial intrusion. The Pariah Nexus gives us a taste of what large-scale psychic suppression might look like. If one could somehow extend that process across the galaxy, starving the warp of emotional access to real space, would Slaanesh weaken? Almost certainly. Could Slaanesh die? That is less clear. Suppression is not destruction. A fire deprived of oxygen may go out, but a chaos god is not merely a flame in one room. It is more like a self-aware weather system generated by the minds of countless species over deep time. Unless every source of psychic resonance ceased, and unless the warp itself could be fundamentally altered, Slaanesh might become diminished rather than erased. Also, the cost of such a project would be horrific. A galaxy smothered under nullification would not simply be safer from chaos. It might become the spiritually dead, psychically amputated, perhaps hostile to the souls of living beings themselves. In Warhammer, solutions of this magnitude tend to resemble another form of apocalypse. The Aeldari themselves preserve perhaps the most famous internal answer to Slaanesh in the form of Yinad, the god of the dead. The broad hope behind this mythic project is that the collected souls of the Aeldari dead might awaken into a new deity capable of confronting and perhaps destroying Slaanesh. This idea is emotionally powerful because it turns the ancient wound back upon its source. The dead of a devoured people become the weapon that avenges them. It offers the Aeldari not merely survival, but release. But here again, certainty vanishes. The lore around Yinad is intentionally unstable, prophetic, and incomplete. Some strands suggest Yinad, if fully awakened, could indeed slay Slaanesh. Others imply that this would require the death of all Aeldari, or some catastrophic final gathering of souls. Still others leave open the possibility that even if Slaanesh were overthrown, the aftermath would be stranger and less liberating than expected. Gods in Warhammer do not solve problems cleanly. They refract them into new mythologies. Even if Yinad could destroy Slaanesh, we must ask what destroy would mean in this context. Would Slaanesh cease entirely? Would the god's energies be consumed, transformed, divided, or inherited? Could the underlying psychic pattern, impulses of excess and obsession, ever vanish from sentient life? If not, might a successor arise? Could Slaanesh return under another name, just as storms return when the climate remains unchanged? This is where warp metaphysics becomes especially slippery. In a material sense, causes precede effects. In the warp, things can be retroactive, symbolic, and non-linear. Slaanesh was born at a particular point in galactic history, but once born, Slaanesh's existence reverberates strangely through warp time. Some texts and interpretations suggest that from the warp's perspective, once a god exists, it may have always existed in some sense, because the warp does not obey linear chronology. This does not erase the historical reality of the fall, but it does make destruction harder to think about. If a god is temporally entangled with its own birth, and with the emotional patterns that continuously renew it, then ending it may require more than winning a future battle. It may require altering realities at multiple levels at once. There is also the problem of definition. When people ask whether Slaanesh could be destroyed, they often imagine one of three different outcomes without separating them. The first is weakening. That means reducing Slaanesh's influence, starving its worship, closing warp breaches, shielding souls, and limiting the god's reach into real space. The second is shattering. That means breaking Slaanesh's coherent identity, perhaps splitting it into lesser powers or dispersing its essence. The third is true erasure, meaning that no meaningful continuity of Slaanesh remains at all. These are not the same, and law may permit one more easily than another. Weakening seems plainly possible. The Chaos gods rise and fall in influence relative to one another. Great events empower one, then another. The galaxy itself has moods. A crusade, a plague, a massacre, a spiritual awakening, all can alter the balance. Slaanesh can be denied prey in specific contexts. Individual souls can escape. Worlds can be shielded. Cults can be purged. Entire civilizations can adopt disciplines specifically designed to prevent feeding the Dark Prince too richly. None of this kills the god, but it proves that power is not perfectly static. Shattering is more speculative, but not absurd by the standards of the setting. Warp entities can merge, divide, be reborn, or emerge from psychic concentrations. Lesser gods and demonic powers rise and are consumed. The line between identity and energy is not stable in the immaterium. If a power as vast as Slaanesh were subjected to an equally vast counterforce, perhaps through Yin-Aid, perhaps through some impossible conjunction of Emperor, Kegarak, Necron anti-warp technology, and galactic psychic upheaval, then the god's present form might be broken. Yet even this might not produce peace. The shards of excess could become many smaller horrors instead of one great one. True erasure is the hardest concept. To erase Slaanesh utterly, you would need not only to defeat the current divine coherence, but also to remove or permanently nullify the emotional and metaphysical conditions that generate it. That means confronting excess, obsession, addiction, vanity, ecstatic cruelty, and the hunger for perfection across the galaxy, across species, across all future time. In other words, you would need to solve sentience. And this, quietly, is why chaos is so hard to defeat in Warhammer 40,000. Chaos is not just an external invasion. It is an intimate consequence of thought and feeling. The warp reflects mortal minds, and mortal minds continuously produce the very patterns they fear. Slaanesh is especially vivid because the Aeldari made the process so spectacularly visible. But the principle is universal. If every temple of Slaanesh were burned tomorrow, if every daemon were banished, if every artifact were locked away, as long as minds somewhere still reached beyond need into compulsion.
That does not mean Slaanesh is invulnerable in every sense. It means the battle is ontological rather than merely military. The Imperium, of course, is terrible at this kind of battle. It can repress behavior, it can censor pleasure, it can punish deviance, but repression is not spiritual transcendence. In many ways, the Imperium breeds extremity, obsession, cruelty, and fanatical fixation on a scale that still nourishes chaos, even if not always in the forms it intends to fight. Human history in 40K is not a clean antidote to Slaanesh. It often supplies fresh pathways into damnation. The Drukhari present an even more tragic case. They know Slaanesh is real in the most intimate and horrifying way. They structure their society around forestalling soul drain through the suffering of others. This is a grotesque adaptation, not a cure. Commorragh is a labyrinth of appetites sharpened into survival mechanisms. Every cruelty buys time. Every indulgence is both resistance and surrender. The Drukhari hate Slaanesh, but they inhabit a civilization shaped like an echo
of the same excess that birthed the god. They are proof that one can flee a fire and still live inside its smoke. The craft-world Aeldari are a more hopeful model, at least comparatively. Their path system exists to prevent the slide into uncontrolled obsession. Aeldari commit themselves to disciplined roles, walking one path at a time, so that identity does not dissolve into endless appetite. This is one of the clearest in-universe acknowledgements that Slaanesh is fed not merely by actions, but by psychic intensity without restraint. The path is medicine against excess. Yet even this medicine is partial. The danger never vanishes. The Aeldari remain vulnerable. Their dead still require protection. Their civilization is survival through control, not victory. And there is a deeper irony here. The very traits that empower Slaanesh can also produce beauty, brilliance, mastery, and art. Slaanesh's domain includes perfectionism, sensation, and passion, not only crude lust and pain. That breadth is part of what makes the god so insidious. The path into damnation does not always begin with obvious evil. It can begin with the desire to create the perfect son, to feel one more layer of experience, to become flawless in craft or body or thought, and then to surrender boundaries in pursuit of the absolute. Excess is rarely announced as excess at the start. Because of that, destroying Slaanesh would not just mean suppressing vice. It might require sterilizing some of the very intensities that make sentient cultures vibrant. This is another reason why anti-chaos victory so often sounds like death in a different voice. A galaxy stripped of obsession may also be stripped of aspiration's dangerous edge. A cosmos without excess may be safer, but perhaps less alive. Warhammer is cruel enough to ask whether the things that corrupt civilization are entangled with the things that animate it. So what would happen if Slaanesh were somehow weakened dramatically, even if not fully destroyed? The consequences would be enormous, especially for the Aeldari. The most immediate change would be spiritual. The species-long terror of soul consumption might loosen. Spirit stones and infinity circuits could become less desperate necessities. The craft worlds might rediscover forms of existence no longer defined by constant posthumous peril. The Drukhari would face an even stranger transformation. Their whole social order depends on staving off Slaanesh's hunger. If that pressure weakened, Commorragh might fracture, reform, or collapse into civil war as old incentives disappeared. The Ynnari, meanwhile, would likely interpret any weakening of Slaanesh as validation of their eschatological mission. Prophecy would harden into momentum. Aeldari politics, already fragmented, could be convulsed by sudden hope. And hope in 40K is dangerous. The species that has spent 10,000 years surviving through caution might lunge toward destiny in ways that unleash fresh catastrophes. Weakening Slaanesh could save souls, but it could also trigger an Aeldari resurgence that destabilizes large regions of the galaxy. Humanity would not be untouched. Imperial cults devoted to purity and vigilance would proclaim divine vindication. Ordo-Malleus factions would race to exploit the shift. Rogue psykers, cults, and heretics who once leaned towards Slaanesh might be driven into the arms of other gods. That matters because chaos is not a pie, where removing one slice simply leaves empty space. Emotional energies can be redirected. A galaxy with less Slaaneshi corruption might see surges in Khorne frenzy, Tzeentchian scheming, or Nurgle's despairing embrace, depending on how societies react. This possibility is often overlooked. Slaanesh does not monopolize destructive emotion. If obsession and indulgence are curtailed through authoritarian brutality, Khorne may feed on the violence. If cultures respond with paranoid control, Tzeentch may thrive on manipulation and secret ambition. If people sink into hopelessness after spiritual upheaval, Nurgle waits patiently. Chaos is a system of communicative vessels. Lowering one tide may raise another. And if Slaanesh were not merely weakened, but truly destroyed, then we enter the realm of cosmic speculation. The best-case dream is obvious. Countless Aeldari souls are freed or avenged. One of the great predators of the warp is gone. A permanent reduction in galactic suffering becomes possible. But the darker possibilities may be more likely. First, the psychic territory occupied by Slaanesh would not necessarily remain empty. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the warp is worse than nature. The impulses bound to Slaanesh do not stop existing because their current god form dies. They might congeal into successor entities, lesser but numerous. They might be absorbed by rival gods, making those powers stranger and perhaps stronger. Khorne, with all unspent ecstatic aggression, folded into war. Tzeentch, swollen with perfectionist ambition and artistic obsession. Nurgle, digesting the despair of those who lose sensation and meaning. None of these outcomes sound cleaner than the original problem. Second, the death of a chaos god could itself be apocalyptic. Remember the birth of Slaanesh. Gods are not born quietly. If one were to die, the metaphysical shock might tear open regions of reality, collapse warp routes, birth storms, extinguish souls, or ignite psychic disasters across whole sectors. The warp and real space are linked too intimately for divine death to remain a private event. Even victory can scream. Third, there is the possibility that destruction would reveal that Slaanesh had become inseparable from galactic psychic architecture. Removing the god might damage not only corruption, but also entire emotional spectra, cultural forms, and soul pathways. Aeldari metaphysics in particular could be shattered in unexpected ways, because so much of their post-fall existence is built around managing the relationship to Slaanesh. Cut out the disease, and perhaps the scar tissue holding the patient together tears too. In a strange way, Slaanesh's apparent permanence is part of the tragedy of the Aeldari. The fall was not just a sin, followed by punishment. It was the creation of a lasting condition. Their civilization did not merely lose a war, it authored a predator that haunts every descendant forever. That permanence is the moral scale of the fall. If Slaanesh could be easily destroyed, the horror would shrink. Because Slaanesh endures, the catastrophe remains alive. Yet Warhammer also thrives on impossible hopes. The Aeldari have not surrendered entirely. Segarach still schemes. Inad still stirs in prophecy and cult. The Phoenix Lords still fight. Spirit stones still preserve what can be preserved. Every act of discipline on a craft world is, in its own quiet way, a refusal to let Slaanesh have the final word. So the question of destruction remains meaningful, even if the answer is probably no. It matters because it shapes how civilizations resist. If we strip away the grand names and look at the structure underneath, Slaanesh can perhaps be weakened wherever people refuse to let desire become identity, wherever appetite is bounded, wherever art is pursued without self-annihilation, wherever pleasure is not allowed to become worship. The Aeldari path system understands this better than the Imperium's iron puritanism. One fights excess with form, not merely punishment. That may not kill a god, but it may reduce its footholds. Of course, 40K is not a setting where enough people learn healthy boundaries and save the galaxy. It is a setting where structural misery, endless war, and spiritual ignorance keep feeding the fire. Humanity's trillions provide no shortage of obsession. Hive worlds breed escapism and degradation. Noble courts breed vanity and appetite. War zones breed stimulants, violence, and ecstatic surrender. Religious fanaticism slides into self-lacerating extremes. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus can drift into forms of perfectionist fixation that echo Slaanesh in strangely metallic tones. The Dark Prince's menu is broad. That breadth is perhaps the strongest final argument against true destruction. Slaanesh is not sustained by one vice, one species, or one ritual pattern. Slaanesh is sustained by the tendency of conscious beings to push beyond sufficiency, to seek not enough, but more. More feeling, more beauty, more pain, more refinement, more ownership, more self, more surrender. So long as minds exist that can turn longing into compulsion, Slaanesh remains thinkable. And in the warp, what is thinkable at sufficient scale is dangerous. So, could Slaanesh ever be destroyed? In the narrow military sense, almost certainly not. In the wider metaphysical sense, perhaps, but only through events so extreme that they might remake the galaxy or ruin it in a new way. Inniad offers the clearest mythic path, but even that promise is wrapped in uncertainty, sacrifice, and the possibility that one god's death only births another era of horror. The anti-warp technologies of the Necrons might weaken chaos, but likely at the price of a spiritually mutilated cosmos. The Emperor might oppose Slaanesh, but opposition is not erasure. The other Chaos gods might wound and contain, but not truly solve. The most honest answer is that Slaanesh can probably be diminished, resisted, denied, starved locally, outmaneuvered spiritually, and perhaps one day shattered in form. But utterly destroyed? Only if the universe itself changed so profoundly that the psychic logic of excess no longer had room to become divine. And if that happened, we may no longer recognize the Warhammer galaxy at all. Maybe that is the final quiet truth hidden inside the question. Asking whether Slaanesh can die is really asking whether sentient life can stop creating gods out of its own extremes. Whether a civilization can feel deeply without devouring itself. Whether desire can remain desire without becoming a throne in hell. The Aeldari answered that question once, and answered it terribly. Their descendants have spent 10,000 years trying to answer it differently. And for all the scale of divine war, that is why Slaanesh remains such a haunting figure. Not because the Dark Prince is simply evil, though evil is certainly there. Not because Slaanesh is merely seductive, though seduction is central. But because Slaanesh represents the point where civilization's finest sensibilities and darkest appetites stop being opposites and become mirrors. The god was born from refinement, curdled into monstrosity. That is harder to dismiss than brute savagery. It feels uncomfortably close. So tonight, as the galaxy burns in its usual endless way, Slaanesh endures. Not invincible in every moment, but embedded. Resisted by the disciplined, courted by the damned. Hated by the Aeldari. Used by cults. Feared by inquisitors. Mocked, perhaps, by Segarak. Dreamed of by artists and monsters who no longer know the line between wonder and ruin. A god with a birthday, and yet perhaps no grave. If you've made it this far, and the warp has not claimed your attention entirely, let this be the last thought to drift away with. In Warhammer 40,000, the deadliest powers are often the ones that do not come from outside, but from within. Fed patiently by every unguarded excess. Slaanesh may never truly die, not because the god is too strong to fight, but because the hunger behind the god is written into the souls of thinking beings. And until that changes, the Prince of Excess will always be waiting, just beyond restraint. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through the lore, feel free to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment with the next impossible question you want explored.